And with me, we have Valerie Huelsman. And what we're going to talk about right now is we're going to talk about how you can engage with your homeowners association. And let me introduce Valerie is a Nova native and has worked in the environmental management field for 12 years, focusing on insect and forest monitoring, integrated pest management, and leading environmental assessments and related educational initiatives. She is an ISA certified arborist and is working on her board certified master arborist certification. She was recently hired as the natural resources specialist and master gardener coordinator for Virginia Cooperative Extension Prince William Unit, and also enjoys continuing to contribute her time to local volunteer efforts. For everybody who's watching at home and everyone who's with us today, we're going to try and save questions for the roughly the last 10 minutes or so of the presentation. If anyone's at home wants to ask a question, they can just leave it in the comment box on Zoom. And we'll get that underway, and I'll let Valerie begin.
Thank you, Jared. It's great to be here with you all today. This will be a little bit more of a casual presentation. I think there are many different ways to approach engaging with your HOA, so I decided to kind of take a brief tackle of the topic. I think it's an important topic. We have many HOAs in Prince William County, and there's a lot of good work that HOA committees and others do. So I am going to save a little bit of extra time at the end where I hope we can talk a little bit more amongst ourselves about our HOA and our collective efforts. So I hope to save a little bit of time at the end to do that, as well as the people who are on Zoom. Next slide, please, guys. So we're going to cover a couple things: why natives, kind of good location candidates, what works for your particular community, an assessment of active groups and partners you can reach out to, a little bit about laws and regulations, and kind of at the end, I'll just kind of revisit the breakdown of the steps for you to get involved with your HOA. Next slide. So why natives? I think all of you here, after especially all of our talks, and I know we have a very experienced naturalist here with us today too, we know that natives are good. We know that we want to, when we talk about them to other members of our community, it's good to keep it simple. You know, native plants are species that have co-evolved with our native wildlife and are best able to support them. They thrive in our conditions and they do great. You know, there's a lot of concerns that we'll take a look at in the next couple of slides, but I think keeping it simple to make sure that it's well understood and it's just reinforcing that this is a nationwide effort on the part of many people is a really good place to start when you're trying to talk up the value of natives. Next slide, please. So we have over 70 homeowner condo associations in Prince William County, so that's a pretty large number. Association property often has both maintained areas and preserved natural areas. So there is a lot of potential to either expand some of those natural areas, continue to do management of them, and also make new areas. If there's a place of large lawn section that you feel could be better served by giving another use to the community, especially through using native plants, that's definitely a conversation that's worth having with your HOA. HOAs also set the standards for the community literally. Usually there is a guideline that expresses exactly what the HOA values in terms of the common property and also what homeowners should be doing on their own property. Sometimes those overlap, sometimes they are very separate. Each HOA is a little bit different, but there is value in approaching each of those sets of standards as a citizen concerned about native species. Next slide, please, Jared. So why natives? Again, regional nationwide initiative to encourage native plants, talking about people like Dr. Doug Townley, the Hometown Habitat Initiative, and other great things, Department of Wildlife Resources, all of our partners like Prince William Conservation Alliance, Native Plant Society, all those great organizations are currently doing. That goes a long way, I think, when talking with people about the value of native plants, that it's not just one person coming out and saying, hey, you know, I think natives are great. There is a wide spectrum of individuals and organizations that are really dedicated to this initiative. And switching to natives does save money. I was curious if there was an actual statistic, because I feel like we hear that a lot, that it is a savings value to incorporate natives into our landscaping. But there was a nice statistic from a Penn State site that talked about how the National Wildlife Federation estimates a typical lawn costs $700 per acre per year to maintain. So think about that on the HOA's budget. I mean, HOAs struggle. You know, so if you can give them that talking point, that statistic, they compared that to establishing and maintaining, or I should say maintaining a meadow that is $30 per acre per year by their estimation. So that is from a Penn State Extension website. I highly encourage you to use that. I'm sure there's other great statistics out there. That was the first one I found, but I think that's really eye-opening and kind of changes that perception a little bit, because people that don't necessarily respond to wildlife may respond to cost. So just another talking point, although we wish that they would respond to the wildlife, expanding the native plant communities. But remember too, that lawns are not native to our area. There's only a couple lawn species that are widely used, nimblewill, and then red fescue. Some varieties of it are kind of native, but still most lawns are tall fescue. It takes a lot of lime, a lot of fertilizer, a lot of aeration, a lot of compost. Compost is a good thing, but still you got to continue to apply it over this wide swath of area. If people are looking for a really uniform lawn, you're looking at herbicides, you're looking at potentially pesticides. So just think about those costs. There's ways to do it more cost effectively and more sustainably. We'll talk about that a little bit more in next couple slides, but just again, something to talk about during these discussions with your HOA. And definitely use available resources. So this is a part of a brochure series that Plant Nova Natives has, and these are 5 easy plants to go in sunny conditions. You don't have to go out of your way to make your own plant list necessarily. Use the resources that you have. I know sometimes in the past, talking with my own HOA, I felt kind of a pressure to come up with my own stuff. You don't necessarily have to go that far if you don't want to. Use things that were tried, proven, and that we know that work well in the Northern Virginia area. So I highly encourage you, if you have not yet already, to check out the Plant Nova Natives website. They have so many great resources on there. Of course, there's great extension resources too, Department of Wildlife Resources. There's a lot of great things out there, but I definitely encourage you to check out the Plant Nova Natives website. Next slide, please, Jared. So these are some arguments that I've heard in the past. So kind of thinking of these things as you're kind of approaching your HOA might be helpful, just to anticipate a little bit. So I get the not colorful enough argument a lot. So there's some people that want things like butterfly bushes, crepe myrtles, things that have a super long bloom time. There's some natives that do have a super long bloom time. Liatris is a pretty good example of that. There's many different species of liatris. There are definitely others that have a long bloom time. Some of our coneflowers, some of our rudbeckias. So there are definitely some species out there that can give you some lasting color. Not easy enough to, or I didn't even talk about fall color. Fall color too. Sumacs are gorgeous. There's all sorts of blueberries also have gorgeous fall color. So again, you can definitely frame those arguments in a place where it's a little bit hard for them to reject. There's also sometimes an argument about not easy enough to find. It depends on who you go to. Definitely if you're going to a garden center. Plant Nova Natives and the Virginia Cooperative Extension Master Gardeners of Prince William are also supporting this. So we are helping to sticker and make sure that people know what a Northern Virginia native is. So look for that sticker when you're going up to the nursery. Depending on the size of your HOA, you might be working with a contractor to get better pricing on things. You should still be able to find a contractor that is able to find you native species. Whenever possible, you do want to use straight up native species. You don't want to go to a nativar or a cultivar, because potentially those can escape into the wild and they may change some of those native species to where they're not getting the support our wildlife necessarily needs. So whenever possible, going to that straight native ecotype that's kind of locally established is what you want to do. You do get the complaint sometimes that they are too weedy. They're and sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes people read kind of aggression and being able to grow quickly and fill in as weediness. There's something called cues to care that a couple different people have used. So having something like a mulch border can be very helpful to just kind of distinguish between plants that you're showcasing as part of your garden versus lawn versus kind of other garden beds. Having kind of a little bit of lawn in the front. Studies have shown also helps just the eye to kind of focus on the garden elements and giving that little bit of extra space that kind of makes people feel it's more typical garden-like than just an assortment of random plants. So kind of think about those concepts as you kind of make your plans and start approaching people. These small changes can make a big difference in people's perception of some of these native species. Bees is, for those of us who are wildlife lovers, that is not a negative whatsoever, but I've heard quite a few people be concerned that their children are going to be close to bees, it's too close to the walkway. If you think that that's a concern, send them back a little bit. Do some things that are maybe some native grasses, some blue fescue, some other things that might work in terms of just getting that separation between the pollinator type plants and kind of areas where people have a tendency to walk, or extend the little mulch buffer a little bit. That can also be helpful. And sometimes that can be an educational piece too. Hey, we need plants to support our bees, especially our native bees, our honey bees. We have all sorts of little tiny bees as well that like these native flowers that we have. So yeah, it can definitely be a talking point as well. Next slide, please, Jared. So how do you find out where you can incorporate more natives? There's definitely a few different ways to do that. Just doing kind of a visual survey of your surrounding area. I think all of us have a general idea of the extent of our neighborhood. There is a very useful GIS tool called Prince William County Mapper. For those of us, are we all Prince William County residents in here? No, some of us are not. So
we use Jade.
Jade, okay, so you probably have your own version of a geographic information system that kind of covers parcels and kind of covers neighborhoods and roads and all that. So use your local equivalent. But for Prince William County residents, it is Prince William County Mapper. It's a very useful resource. You can search for specific addresses. You can see who owns certain parcels. So if you're looking in kind of a neighborhood area, you can click on the parcel and say, oh, okay, this is HOA property. You know what? My community association owns that. I can check in with management, in with the board of directors, and see what potentially we could do to that parcel. So that's just another good way after you do that visual check to go back, confirm, and kind of make sure that what you're dealing with is your HOA land. Another really good feature, at least for Prince William County, is the ability to see resource protection areas. So these are extremely useful. This is kind of a 100-foot buffer by perennial streams and also a buffer by wetland areas. So these areas are protected in most cases. There are parts of Prince William County that were developed before 1990. And so some of these areas have been grandfathered in. So wherever possible, we try to promote residents to increase their buffer if they have property that it runs adjacent. Montclair HOA is a good example of that. That was developed before 1990 primarily. So there are a lot of residents that back up to the lake. So looking for ways to kind of just increase that native plant buffer that goes a long way to water quality. Just like this is our Powell's Creek Resource Protection Area here, which is relatively well protected, but it does run up into kind of grassland right on the other side of this. But this is an example of what some of our local perennial streams are looking like. Next slide, please, Jared. So thinking again about where you can start within your own neighborhood. For a first-time project, say no one else has really done anything with natives yet, start small. Think about a small area, say in front of a community center, maybe in front of your signs that designate your homeowners association. Something like that is a great way just to have a proof of concept, just to show people what could possibly be done. Expand existing beds and connect trees. So oftentimes we have one single tree, one little ring of mulch around it. And you can have that in multiple areas, these little isolated trees, having a bed to expand around them and allow those roots to grow out, be protected from all the things that we do to our lawn to keep it thriving and healthy. That is another great way to kind of start small, just start some of those projects. There are wonderful plants that you can establish amidst trees. You do want to give a little bit of space for the roots and be very careful when you're digging around those sections. But using smaller plants, letting them kind of grow up and kind of establish in that area is a great way to kind of expand those sections and help to protect your trees at the same time. Removing areas of turf and creating brand new beds is another great way to do it. Say you have just this large area of turf and maybe families use one section, but you have this other section here that's not as used. Why not try to start a bed there? Establish some more native plants that you have in the community, kind of expand your plant community of your area. So that's another way that you can start this sort of initiative. We get a lot at Virginia Cooperative Extension about community garden requests, people wanting to start them. It is a challenging thing to do because you do need a lot of rules and regulations. You need a committed kind of task force to making sure that everyone kind of participates in the way you want them to. But if you have a willing group of people who want to get that started, I wouldn't recommend that as your first project, but maybe a continued project later on with a lot of board support. If you do have a board-run HOA, that might be a way to go. Community regulations for homeowners, so you don't just have to necessarily look at common area property, also look at what they are requiring out of each individual homeowner. So all of those bylaws, all of those regulations that you, what is the right word I'm looking for, that you agreed to follow when you bought into your neighborhood, those are all by law, you must have those accessible to you. So if you don't have them for whatever reason, request them. And that is something that can still be changed. You have the power to do that as a resident of the community. You may have to petition someone of your board to sponsor a motion, or however else your board is run. They might have to bring it up before the other board members, have a vote, and kind of even perhaps have the rest of the residents kind of take a look at it and vote on it, depending on how your HOA functions. That is definitely something that you can do. So say your HOA requires 70% lawn in each individual's yards. That's not unheard of. There are some places that do that. You could try to shrink that. Or in the case of, we'll talk about a recent bill where we're looking at conservation landscaping, you can severely restrict that. So there are definitely things that you can do on an individual homeowner level as well that kind of incorporate feedback from the rest of the HOA. So we talked about resource protection areas a little bit. So in the case of those areas that have been grandfathered in, you can try to reestablish some of those resource protection areas. In general, they're ideally should be left alone and kind of managed as a natural state, and they function as kind of a buffer for all of the potential pollutants that are kind of making its way down to the watershed. It's kind of a green infrastructure vegetative buffer in order to soak up some of those things like nutrients and fertilizer, some of those other pollutants that may be making its way into waterways from emissions from vehicles and things like that. Those are all things that kind of maintaining that natural buffer around our waterways helps to prevent things like sediment too. Sediment is a massive source of pollutants to our streams and to Chesapeake Bay. So all of those things go a long way to making sure that we have good water quality in our area. Next slide, please. So just because a lot of grant money in our area is tied to Chesapeake Bay watershed, I just wanted to go over this concept a little bit if we weren't familiar with it, unless we are all familiar with it. Anyone have any questions on the concept of watershed, Chesapeake Bay? Are you all pretty well versed in all of this? If so, we can skip right past this. Next slide, please, Jared. So just, we all live downstream, the common saying, these are all areas in Prince William County. All of these areas impact overall water quality. Next slide, please, Jared. So this is the Chesapeake Bay. You guys are all pretty familiar with it. Largest US estuary. It is very productive. It has been getting better. There are kind of different indices associated with Chesapeake Bay progress and a lot of different organizations that help to make it a more environmentally suitable, friendly, sustainable area. But this is what we're looking at when we talk about the Chesapeake Bay. Next slide, please. So going back to individual locations within our communities. So one thing I do want to emphasize, because I think that a lot of effort sometimes is on establishing new locations. To me as an arborist, valuing what is already there is also super, super important. So this is a beautiful tulip poplar tree, Liriodendron tulipifera. And it's one of my favorite specimens in our neighborhood, and it was saved kind of close to an elementary school, so it's a beautiful tree. It takes a very long time for a tree to grow that size and for it to be able to offer all those benefits that it's offering. Kind of what is around this tree is maintained turf, so they don't really have an area that has been kind of protected around that root system, and for trees, the root system is super critical. That's really what drives everything else of a tree. So doing the best that we can to make sure that those roots maintain access to water, maintain access to air. They're not getting compacted by a lot of foot and vehicle traffic, tractor traffic to have to continue to mow that area. So having this kind of come out and kind of establish a more natural area versus potentially establishing a new bed somewhere else may make sense in your situation. So again, just some of the things to think about as you start to think about locations that you might be able to modify in your area. This is a super cool tool called MyTree. This is offered by the iTree suite that a lot of different groups have worked on. The Forest Service, Casey Trees, a couple others. So this actually can calculate the benefits that each tree provides. So I guesstimated, I haven't measured this, but I guesstimated this at 45 inches diameter. I think it's actually bigger. But so this is giving $15.63 of estimated benefits per year over its lifetime. Its CO2 uptake has been quantified at $783, carbon storage at over 9,000 pounds, carbon dioxide equivalent 33,000 pounds. So take that versus planting a brand new tree. That new tree per year is going to offer 16 cents of estimated benefits. So that's super cool. If you ever run into anyone who's like, you know what, it's just a tree, you know what, we can take it down. This is a super cool method to just convince them this is doing something. Besides being a beautiful specimen within our community, it's giving us these benefits. So I highly encourage you to make use of this tool. It's free, fast, easy. Just look up MyTree and it'll bring you right to it. And going back to wildlife benefits, you know, oaks are one of our greatest benefits. For those of you that have read Dr. Talamy's work, oak trees support some 500 caterpillars. White oaks in particular are one of our greatest trees. This is one of our most common trees, actually, tulip trees across statewide. So it's also a host for eastern tiger swallowtails, spicebush swallowtail, viceroy caterpillars. All of those guys need this tree locally. Nectar for honeybees, birds, butterflies, flowers eaten by deer, birds, squirrels. So for your more wildlife associated people, being able to kind of give them a context of what this tree is actually doing may give you some support as well. So kind of think about these dual ways that you can convince someone that, hey, it's worth maintaining this beautiful tree within our community. Next slide, please, Jared. So again, green infrastructure, another good kind of quote for you from the EPA: a city block will generate 5 times the runoff as a forest the same size. So these trees are doing their work. This is what we natively kind of had in our area of our forests. We had some areas of kind of scrub, brush, and you know, the eastern US has been managed for a long period of time by native communities. So there's definitely been some differing kind of ecosystems, but overall, this is our dominant ecosystem. In our area, oak hickory forests are our dominant ecosystem. Next slide, please, Jared. So structure, when we're talking about wildlife, structure is also very critical. If you have an HOA like mine, we have very small lots. There isn't a lot of opportunity necessarily to get structure. Mine's about less than a quarter of an acre. So I do have some trees of varying size. I have one beautiful hickory that I'm very fortunate to have, but I can't really do the same sense of structure that you could on a larger HOA property. So thinking about ways to manage this is actually out at Leopold's Preserve. I just thought it was kind of a cool photo, but you do have different layers. You have kind of native vegetation, kind of, I think there's a little bit of silk grass in there maybe, but there might be some deer tongue as well. And we have kind of these younger, I think they were black locust trees kind of coming up, and then we have some older oaks and hickories to the side. So that way you're giving structure to all these different types of wildlife. You have this kind of natural area here, a lot more mature forest in the background. So different types of birds need different sorts of habitat, you have different sorts of insects that need trees versus shrubs. So all of those are things to think about when you're thinking about what sort of changes you might want to see, what sort of changes you might want to promote within your HOA. Next slide, please. So what works for your community? Some commonalities and essentials kind of in between all of our communities. So there's a lot of differences, but there's a lot of things that stay the same. To me, I think communication is really essential. Having a clear vision, a clear goal, kind of communicating that to the neighborhood at large whenever you can, I think can go a long way to enacting change. Sometimes approaching one board member who's very vocal, if you do have a board, can get you good results, especially if that person will really be an advocate for whatever your idea is to establish more native plants. But I think publishing things in your local newsletter, getting on your Facebook groups, doing all that sort of things can go a long way. In this case, this is a neighborhood locally that they are trying to maintain water quality by leaving a no-mow space. Some residents might see this as an eyesore. They might see a wild, weedy area that's not doing anything. Hey, why I paid for this waterfront property, why don't I get nice grass down to it? You know, but we know that this is serving an essential function by filtering those nutrients, keeping the root system, keeping the soil in place, all of those good things that this vegetation is doing. So they do have a sign here. So again, communication is super critical, just making sure that people know why things are the way they are and why you may be supporting a particular idea. Next slide, please. So a few things that you need to do before you start establishing or continuing to maintain a new area. At Virginia Cooperative Extension, we promote soil testing, that even though you're dealing with natives, you still want to see what level your soil is at. Sometimes I do see that there's people that do not recommend fertilization or changing the soil when you're dealing with natives. I'd say it depends on what you're working with. If you're working with something that's been compacted, everything has been taken off, you just have this super bare compacted area that's grass is struggling to grow in, weeds are struggling to grow in, you might need to do some remediation on that place. So I would always start with a soil test, even though you're dealing with natives. Our soils get changed so much during the course of development. If you're dealing already in an already developed area, you want to take a look and see what that soil is actually doing. If you do start planning, do a utility check. You don't want to start making plans and then realize, hey, I got this gas line running through here, I was going to plant this beautiful grove of trees. It might not be the best idea. So definitely do a utility check fairly early in the process before you start with your bigger plans. So again, especially if it's been turf, I would recommend doing some preparation to the soil. Adding compost only helps. So doing that, there's a lot of great publications to follow about building up soil. It's not something that's immediate, it's something that takes time, especially if you're kind of doing it on a budget. But compost is a great way to start. Watering for the first few years as necessary is super important, and that's where a lot of these projects kind of go astray. If you don't have someone continuing to maintain it, whether that's volunteers, whether that's your general contractor maintenance crew, you need to make sure that someone is out there giving care to these new plants, even though they're natives. You know, they may require less care overall for their lives, but those first couple of years, especially when we get to these crazy summer months where we have no rain for a month, they're not going to be able to survive that. So definitely make sure that you have someone willing to get out there and maintain them. Same with the maintenance schedule. You have some young trees that you're planting. Virginia Department of Forestry has very good quality, low-cost trees. If you're going to start a large area of forest, you want to reforest some spot in your neighborhood, they're a great place to go to. But you might still have to do some corrective pruning just to make sure they're growing up the way that you want them. So you do need a little bit of a maintenance schedule. If you're dealing with shrubs and you do want a little bit more manicured native look, you might have to continue to do some maintenance. So think about that. Make sure that the contractor you're using or the volunteers you're using have a good sense of when they should be doing something, what those corrective pruning steps should look like. So clear expectations of goals and management to the community. So that would include if you have a management company that oversees all the lawn care, you need to make sure you have that conversation with them of what exactly you want to see. And depending on the expertise of that management community, they may only be more on kind of the vehicle or maintenance or kind of utility side and not as much on the plant side, or they may be super on the plant side, but they have their own ideas about how things should be done. If you can give them science-backed information that says, hey, the extension says this, Department of Wildlife says this, beat off Virginia Department of Forestry says this, that's a good way to kind of move forward and kind of keep your relationship kind of positive. So contractors, definitely, you need to make sure to work closely with them. Sometimes it can be better to be there on the ground when trees are getting planted, when shrubs are getting planted, or have volunteers to kind of help you out, just to make sure that everything is very clear in between the people doing the work and what your expectations are. And again, with that support, it's really important to have that team in place to make sure everything is getting watered, everything is getting maintained the way you want it. That could be a committee, that could be just a general group of master naturalists, master gardeners that are helping out, but you want that team there to just continue to monitor everything that's going on. Next slide, please. So we say this phrase a lot as master gardeners. So right plant, right place. Even when you're dealing with natives, this is very crucial. So you're not going to stick these beautiful ferns out in the middle of a sun islands devil strip right by the road where you have kind of compacted soil and full sun. Make sure that you're thinking well about where these actually need to be placed so they will do their very best. Next slide, please. So things that may be unique to your community. So definitely on the regulation side, I think it varies quite a bit from community to community. Like I know in our neighborhood, we are not allowed to grow vegetables in our front yards. I don't know how many of the rest of you have that. I think it's because it's perceived as, I'm not even sure quite honestly, but that is just something that is somewhat unique to us. But others may have, you must have like I said, 80% of your lawn must be grass. I've heard of some HOAs where the section right by the sidewalk or the road must be grass up to a certain point. So there are all sorts of restrictions, and HOAs are allowed to do that. That's what you agreed to upon becoming a member of the HOA. So definitely be very aware of what those regulations are. And again, if you take an issue to them, I mean, it might be something that you can approach the board, approach the management company and be like, hey, what can we do to change this? This is why I feel we need to change this. This is the research that supports that, there's food insecurity in our community. We want to try to grow some of our own food. We have dwindling natural habitat. We want to help support some of our wildlife. So you can definitely have those conversations. Preserved land, there are some HOAs that have a lot of preserved land. A lot of times it's around those resource protection areas because those areas cannot be built after 1990, except in very rare circumstances. So definitely that is something that varies quite a bit. And if you have preserved land, it's not to say, like say your neighborhood is pretty much all woodlands and houses and that's it. That's not to say there isn't work to do. Invasive species are sadly everywhere. You have a forest, at this point, it really has to be managed. You can't just kind of leave it, forget about it, let it do its thing. Those of us that have done a lot of kind of volunteer work around the community, there are so many invasives out there, and our trees really cannot withstand a lot of the pressures of them. So things like Japanese honeysuckle, things like kudzu, it kind of depends on your area, but you get these differing types of kind of plant communities kind of infiltrating our native plant communities. So that's definitely something to be on your radar. Definitely something you can work on if you do not have areas to completely start fresh. There's still a lot of value in protecting what we have. Number of homeowners can vary quite a bit too. There are HOAs that have 12 houses. There are HOAs that have 2,000, 3,000 houses. So that's definitely can impact how your community is run. Those really smaller communities, you might not have a management company. You might not have a board. You might just have a couple of homeowners that get together every once in a while and go, okay, you know what, I think we should do this. Okay, it might be very informal, very casual. So you can definitely shift your approach towards what you have in your own community. So amount of resources available, kind of official management, kind of the same thing. So there are communities that have a lot of resources available every year to doing landscaping, and there's some where it might be, only if we have this bit of extra money left over can we actually get around to doing this. So those might be the organizations where you want to look more at grant funding and things like that. So again, something to consider about what does your budget look like? Who is in charge of figuring out what money goes where? So structure of community, board of directors, committees, informal working groups. There's The larger communities do tend to have a lot of committees, landscaping committees. Who here is on the landscaping committee? So yeah, so a few of us, yep. So there's a lot of really good work that goes on in those sorts of committees. So if you know that you have one and you're passionate about helping out and making sure those natives are getting planted and being maintained well, that's a great way to help out in your own community. Next slide, please, Jared. So partners, there are a lot of partners available to help you out. So this was compiled together from a different presentation talking about people that contribute to the Chesapeake Bay watershed efforts. But in reality, these are all people that also contribute to native species efforts because that's what helps to support the Chesapeake Bay as well. So there are a lot of individuals and a lot of federal, state, local organizations that can potentially help you out either by giving funding, by giving advice. So definitely be creative when you're looking for particular partners that may be able to help you out. I was hearing about a Change X grant that a local community was able to get. So look out there. Things are always changing. So there may be grants available this year that are not going to be available next year. There may be things that have not been available in the past that are now present. So definitely continue to look and monitor that situation if you do think that you need a source of funding. Next slide, please. So assessment of local partners. So there are a couple local groups that could definitely help you out. Soil and Water Conservation District, if you have not yet applied for a Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, cost share, I highly encourage you to do that. And this should be available statewide for those of you that are not in Prince William County. Check with your local Soil and Water Conservation District. They can let you know what they have going on, but this is a wonderful source of money for projects that kind of look to, they have even started to look to invasive management in some of these grants. They can also do things like, they really focus a lot on protecting water quality, so looking at places that are experiencing a lot of erosion. And they will kind of value each project based on a couple different parameters, like what the exposure is like. Is it really prominent in the community? You know, is it really contributing to water quality? Is it a very environmentally sensitive site? So there's a lot of different things they look at in terms of approving these grants, but I highly encourage you to take a look at that because that funding is definitely out there. Virginia Department of Forestry also offers a lot of great resources as well. Growing Shade Virginia is a new resource actually, so this will give you $25 off trees that are $50 or more. So they're a little bit larger trees. I like to recommend smaller trees because they will establish a little bit faster. They're easier and less expensive to plant. But if you need larger trees, especially in kind of widely traveled areas where kids might get into them, pets might get into them, you might need a little bit of a larger tree. So definitely check that out if you're looking to plant anything in the near future. I think it's only open through spring type season. They do also have an urban and community forest grant, and that is available to HOAs if you're applying in partnership with another local organization. So that is another way to get some funding. And I did note on there that does also include invasive management now. So again, for those of you that have kind of some established forest area where you have a lot of these invading plants, that is 100% something that you can take a look at. And so Virginia Cooperative Extension, again, who I work for, so Master Gardeners of Prince William, we do offer a community garden grant. So that is some funding that is available in Prince William for establishing a new community garden. It's just a few $100s, but you know that money goes a long way to helping to get some of these projects off the ground. Fairfax Water has a great grant program that especially helps out homeowners that may live in waterways that contribute to Occoquan River. So that's another really good program. Audubon at Home is a wonderful resource where a very knowledgeable naturalist will come out, evaluate your property, let you know, hey, that's an invasive plant. Hey, you got a good plant there. I really think that this plant would do well if you can plant it and get it established. It's a wonderful program. It doesn't necessarily give you money here in Prince William, unfortunately, but it can get you started and get your property certified, which is another great way to just kind of showcase your efforts to include more natives and just make your neighborhood community more aware. You can also get HOAs certified too in larger properties like churches and other organizations. So definitely something to consider if you have not taken a look at that program yet. Plant Nova Natives and Prince William Wildflower Society are other great resources for our area. Next slide, please, Sharon. So a couple of publications I talked about, I heard from two of my coworkers that this publication was going very well. So if you haven't picked it up, we do have that available online, but I did hear that a lot of people were picking that one up. For lawns, we do have our Best Lawns program, which we are now shifting to a Best Lawns and Landscapes program. So we're kind of starting to include nutrient management planning for more than just lawns. But this is a great way to make sure that if you do have areas of lawn in your community that contractors are putting down the right stuff, what we do is we have a master gardener team that will come out, do some soil sampling for you, do some measurements. They will submit that soil sample into Virginia Tech to get analyzed, and then one of our nutrient management plan writers will write up a plan for your community. You can then in turn give that to your contractor and just let them know this is what is scientifically recommended for our property. What are we currently doing? So that is one way to just reduce the amount of effort that's being put into your lawn and will also give you better results. Next slide, please, Jared. So laws and regulations. So I won't spend a super amount of time on this, but just to kind of give you a heads up, there's this really cool bill that is still in effect right now. There's a little bit more to it, but one thing they're taking a look at is kind of letting people know if there's an invasive species for sale, letting people know, hey, this is actually an invasive species. There are other alternatives to this invasive species that you can plant instead of this guy that will infiltrate into natural areas and be problematic. So this currently is in the session. This is still active. So it will also say plant with caution, invasive plant species may cause environmental harm, ask about alternatives. So that's pretty cool, active bill right now. So potentially this will impact a lot of HOAs as well, because we do still have invasive species, think barberry, still being planted in certain communities. So something to keep an eye out on. For our Prince William County residents, this is new to me, doing kind of a quick search to kind of take a look at more HOA type issues. You can actually call Neighborhood Services. This is a county agency with complaints about your HOA. I'm not quite sure what they would do or what they would not do, but they have this advertised on their website. So this may be a starting point. If you go approach your HOA and you're like, I want to start planting these natives, and they're like, nope. You have a recourse. Maybe approach Neighborhood Services, see if they can help you, see if they can work with you on some of these initiatives. So as part of a community association, just kind of reiterating this, you do have a legally binding agreement to abide by the codes of your HOA. So that's why it's good to play nice with your HOA, kind of be positive, have a good working relationship. Next slide, please, Jared. So we do also have Conservation Landscaping House Bill number 528. We do have an expert in the room who can speak to this a little bit more, but this has been continued to 2025. And so this kind of restricts the amount an HOA can restrict you when you are approaching conservation landscaping. So unfortunately, it's not going to move forward this year. Hopefully next session, it can maybe get some support. More support. I'm sure it had plenty of support this year as well. So this basically allows people to approach conservation landscaping, approach their HOA, say, I want to do this, and they're, as long as they make a good case, as far as I understand this bill, their HOA should essentially say yes and not put a bunch of unreasonable expectations on them. So another good bill to follow. Next slide, please, Jared. This is really cool. This is a recent initiative in Loudoun County. I'm not sure if any of you are from Loudoun that are from outside of Prince William County. Awesome. So this is super cool. We do not have this here in Prince William County yet. It would be awesome to get this off the ground. But this is the Loudoun Invasive Removal Alliance. As I understand it, a bunch of master gardeners were able to help to get this off the ground. So this is essentially a bunch of HOAs who are banding together to help address invasive species. So I think this is super cool. It's a super great way for HOAs and property owners associations to kind of band together, share strategies, share successes, share challenges, and kind of also get some more attention on the invasive plant issue. So definitely check this out. Good for anyone in this area. They have a lot of great information. They're also partnering with a few different agencies and nonprofits, including Blue Ridge Prison, which we had Natalie Walker here from as well. Next slide, please, Jared. So that is essentially it. I told you I'd kind of break down the steps, but I do want to make sure we have time to chat, because we have about 10 minutes left. So that is kind of a stab at thinking about, how we can interact with our HOA, kind of things that we can do to promote native landscaping. So I'm very glad to take any questions, or if you just want to share your own experiences, I would love to hear them as well.
I was asked to provide language for the update of our governing documents. So it's usually called the CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I found it really problematic to kind of get the words that are not too restrictive, but yet get that across. Do you have any examples? Reston Association is often spoken of. I could never figure out what they.
Please go.
Minnesota cities and towns have a lot of language around that. We use that when we were creating the HOA bill that's up there. I can, just email me. I'll send you a list. I have, as part of my research for that bill, I grabbed every single possible example that I could find.
So that was the one thing. The other, let's see here. The other was don't have it right off the bat. Sorry, here we go. My landscapers actually had a multi-floor rose that got loose, and so.
Interesting.
Sorry. I know. Is there any way to get a list of, or any experience for companies that understand sustainable landscaping, that aren't just, unfortunately, well, I think the word is mower and blower.
What county? Yeah.
So I would say that's where the language is very, very important. So when you have a contract with a particular landscaper, they have to abide by the rules of that contract. So.
Yeah, well, the thing is, there's no knowledge in the industry, but yes, I'm writing a contract now.
I would say that Plant Nova Natives has some good information about finding a contractor. I can tell you, I think it's pretty challenging. I don't think we can talk about particular names in here. It's probably, but but I'd say that it is hard because you have workers that are still maybe learning, that maybe don't have the experience that management has. So you have the managers come out and they're like, oh yes, we're gonna do this then, and yes, I completely understand your concerns, and sometimes that is not translated down. But if you have things in writing, this is how it must be done, this is the extension document that I'm referencing that shows a pruning schedule and how you need to be pruning. You can, cite that, hey, you guys are in violation of our contract, you need to do this or refund us, our money. So one thing to consider, I don't think there's a perfect company out there, sadly, but I would check the Plant Nova Natives guide for that.
I want to just point out, there's the reality of whoever's writing the contract is not going to be on your HOA or your personal property. It is very likely to be someone who speaks no English. And therefore, if you really, really care, or you're doing some sort of beginning of the season or whatever, you need a Spanish speaker.
Yeah.
Who can engage with your people, whether they live in your community or something like that. I'm very, very lucky to have a master gardener, landscaper who only works with one other guy who doesn't speak English. But happily, my guys, they are all the time, but that's small scale in a small town. What you do with 2,000 house HOA, I have no idea.
It's very difficult.
Because they will not know.
We have a 700 plus, and it's a very specific contract. And the head landscaper understands, but last spring, I caught this guy coming along with the weed whacker across my lawn.
Yeah.
And I tapped him on the shoulder and I said, what are you doing? He says, I'm cutting down all the liriope. And I looked at him and I said, gee, I don't have any liriope at all in my yard. He had cut down everything.
All the native stuff?
Everything.
Did it come back?
Very common.
He was part of
No, did your stuff come back?
some of it came back, and the head of the landscaping knew that I would pry anybody who tried to cross me. He brought in all sorts of stuff for me to replant, because he knew I was mad. I mean, you don't want to get me mad.
That's a good thing too. I mean, if you have a good working relationship kind of with your contractor, I mean, they know if they do something wrong, they have to make it up to
I
you. So
helped
So
pick
that has to be in the
contract.
contract.
true,
Yeah.
true.
So it wasn't,
One of your starting slides, you talked about communicating with the community. One of the things you mentioned was perception of weeds.
Yeah.
And this is such a stumbling block in talking to the general resident community. Because everybody thinks, oh, I know what a weed is.
Right.
And we have, what we call them the design guidelines, but it's essentially the same thing. It's the covenants that say this is what you must do.
Right.
And the opening page in our design guidelines said, must maintain a weed-free garden,
Right.
period. Every year they have an open session where they ask for comments, and I say, look, guys, you gotta take that out. It makes no sense at all. And he said, well, why not? Everybody knows what a weed is. I said, a weed is a plant growing where you don't want it to grow. Now, it's subjective. Who's the arbiter? Are you the arbiter or am I the arbiter? You know, and so it's like, this is a sticking point because people will say, oh, we got, you guys are putting in weeds. I said, excuse me. Yes, it's butterfly weed, but people want it. So,
But yeah, that's kind of a very valid point and kind of showing areas like the Merrimack Farm Stonehouse Wildlife area behind it. There's also the Master Gardener's Teaching Garden. I think showing more of these examples of locations that feature some of these species is a great way to point to members of the community that might be a little resistant. And then also kind of continuing to have those cues to care that kind of show, hey, we're not treating this like a weed area, even if you don't recognize what these plants are. This is part of our landscaping. So that is a wonderful point in those weeds.
well, what I have
ordinances.
noticed is that some of the people that complain the worst
Mhm.
about the native plants and say it's, you know, weeds. When you go to their yards, they have everything that is totally inappropriate for the environment and totally uncreative and all grass. So, I mean, what do they know? They don't know. They really don't know. So they're complaining about something they really don't understand.
Yeah.
How do you bridge that gap?
Yeah.
I've suggested to my HOA
Sledgehammer.
that they add to our architectural guidelines to not plant anything that is on the Department of Conservation and Recreation's invasive plant list, which is quite lengthy.
Yeah.
But that's a really good jumping off.
That's a great,
Yeah.
good idea.
And that's part of that legislation too, if you guys didn't catch that, they want an update to that, because I believe the last update to that is 2014, if I'm remembering correctly, but that is still a great document. That is what I always refer people to for a starting point for invasive species, because they have, you know, everything on it. It does need a little bit of updating, but it's a wonderful guide for our area to take a look
Who
at
is that
that.
by?
DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation.
Going forward, it's supposed to be updated every 4 years. That's the legislation that was passed last year. But are they gonna do that?
I'm sure they would love to do it. I know how busy all those,
Yes.
all of them are.
Hey, Valerie, there was a question in the chat from Diana. She says, what is the name of the tree tool?
My Tree. It's My Tree is part of the iTree suite, so it's MYTREE.
Oh.
But it is part of iTree, but it's the kind of the lowest level of iTree.
gotcha.
It's an act, right?
Yeah, it's not even, it could be an app, but it's just kind of a
Well,
online web, yeah,
Interesting.
website.
So there is a word encroachment that is used a lot in HOAs.
Yeah.
We just started using it, but evidently, at some point 35 years ago, somebody said you don't allow your exotic plants to get into the open space.
Yeah.
Well, now that would be invasive things. We haven't enforced it. But, you know, you can find 2 or 3 homeowners that have all the plants jumping out that are infecting the whole stream valley. So, you know, encroachment is a word that is often used.
That's a good point. And I mean, one thing to keep in mind, there are some things that will naturalize slightly. And there are some people that think that if the potential is there, it's good to be cautious of that particular plant. But I mean, there are also plants Like daffodils, I don't think that's on an invasive species list, someone correct
Kind
me.
of people have asked me to take it out.
Yeah,
But if
Yes.
somebody's actually planting them, but the one thing that I realized is, in fact, we infected our entire stream valley was the lesser celandine. And
yeah,
the
that's,
history is, you can trace it back literally to greenhouse.
yeah, I mean, it's, we were always learning, and that's maybe something
They
that we
didn't
can.
know.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, a lot of us didn't know during a lot of different periods of plant introduction, so, yeah, we're always learning, that's something we can communicate to. Anyone else have any other thoughts to share?
I
questions?
want to say that, please, we're going forward now, next year, please email your legislators and let them know that you support that bill. It'll have a different bill number next year. But what we had to negotiate with the HOA, HOAs have a nationwide organization that has lobbyists that they pay. And it was me and one other person with the delegate doing our very best to get this bill passed, and they outmaneuvered us. And so please, if you let your legislator know that you support it, they can co-sponsor the bill, and if we can get a long list of co-sponsors, we have a really good chance of getting.
Did you have any Loudon Prince-William co-sponsors, and who's the patron?
Delegate Krizek was our
Where's Krizek?
Krizek.
Fairfax?
Fairfax, yeah, and
Seen this bill.
we would love, yeah, it just didn't play out in the best way possible, but I think the good news is now we have some attention and we can get some, so
I'll look it up and look at the patrons.
It's a start, but it is watered down, so I
it was,
commend you, but it is.
we had to pull it because they watered it down so far that it would actually strengthen the HOAs instead of.
I think the biggest thing we have in Fairfax County is an actual fine of $3,000, I think it goes up $3,000 max for bamboo and birch.
We do have that in Prince William as well, yeah.
That's slide 20. That, it was on this year's GA of HB 528.
I would like to see something in for RPAs in Fairfax County. It has to be in the closing documents identified when people go to closing. Sometimes I've heard people say, my real estate agent said just ignore it, it's important.
Don't listen to your realtor.
But at any point, I thought that would be a good model for saying that if there are invasive species on the property, there needs to be some sort of a monetary.
Yeah,
That would
that's,
be a great legislation.
yeah, keep the thoughts going and hopefully, you know, we'll see what happens.
I did before the done.
Any other chat comments, Jared? Nope, all right, thank you all very much for joining us today, very good to talk to you.